I don't know why, but I have a feeling that a few of my viewers are not going to like the way I pronounce the vehicle's name in this video. Oh well, with that in mind, let's go ahead and kick this one off. Hey everyone, this is John from EastCoastArmory.com, and I'm here today with a model showcase video for this 1/35th scale Sturmgeschütz 3 ausf.F. The model in this video is built for my own personal collection and is not for sale and or purchase. However, like I often mention in these build videos, I frequently take on commission build projects from models ranging between 1/35th scale and 1/6 scale. For availability and pricing information, that information would be best by contacting me through the email address listed below, which is info@EastCoastArmory.com. This model here is built predominantly out of the box. However, I went ahead and added some aftermarket parts to it. We'll be going over the basic build, reviewing the base starter kit, as well as going over some of the other details and features that this kit has. All this information is going to be found in this video, so stay tuned because there's going to be a bunch of content coming right at you. Before we go any further with the video, let's go ahead and take a quick walk around this model. And this vehicle here is the Sturmgeschütz 3 ausf.F. The Sturmgeschütz was a German assault gun that was built and utilized during World War II. Although the vehicle was originally intended to be an assault gun, very quickly the Germans realized that this vehicle made a very excellent tank destroyer, so in addition to the assault gun role, it was also used as a tank destroyer to widespread use. The Sturmgeschütz itself is based, of course, on the Panzer III chassis. At this time, the Panzer III was in full production, and adapting it in order to suit the assault gun role was fairly easy. Unlike some other vehicles of a similar configuration during this time period, in which those vehicles encompass an open type design, the Sturmgeschütz was fully enclosed and was armored throughout the entire vehicle. The original vehicles utilized a short-barreled 75mm gun. This was the exact same gun that was used on the larger Panzer IVs of the period. Because of the vehicle's assault gun role, the need for a fully revolving turret wasn't necessary, so the Sturmgeschütz utilized the German tried and true tactic of using a casemate design. The casemate design left for a vehicle that had very limited transverse capabilities. However, it left for a very small, sleek package, and the vehicle had a much smaller silhouette compared to the other tanks of the period. The Sturmgeschütz itself was originally designed in the late 1930s, however, they entered into mass production in the 1940 timeframe. A good number of these vehicles were produced. However, as the war progressed, it was quite noticeably realized that that short-barreled 75mm gun just wasn't going to be able to do the job as it did previously. By early 1942, a new version of the Sturmgeschütz was developed, and that is this pattern known as the ausf.F. The ausf.F was the first version of this vehicle to incorporate a long-barreled 75mm gun, which had a much higher muzzle velocity, and because of which was going to be better at dealing with armor threats, unlike the previous vehicles that I just mentioned. It is at this point here where the Sturmgeschütz really started to evolve from being an assault gun and started to fulfill the tank destroyer role. The new main gun did, however, introduce a side effect, and that was with the higher velocity gun, you now also had more toxic fumes that were entering into the vehicle after the weapon was fired. In order to deal with this, the ausf version had this very distinctive exhaust fan vent that was located on the roof of the vehicle. With the addition of this fan, the interior crew compartment was now much better at dealing with the exhaust fumes coming from the gun breech. This vehicle was only armed with the single 75mm gun and did not have any other type of secondary armament, such as an MG34 of one flavor or another. This is something that would definitely be addressed and changed on the next iteration of Sturmgeschütz, namely the ausf.G. Automotive-wise, the vehicles kept all of the same components that were found on the other Sturmgeschütz, as well as the other Panzer IIIs of the period. Because of this, parts commonality was something that was a big plus on the Sturmgeschütz family of vehicles. The vehicle itself was powered by a Maybach HL120 TRM V12 gasoline engine, and the vehicles were able to hit a top speed of about 25 miles an hour. The ausf variant of the Sturmgeschütz was not in production for a long period of time. It stated that the vehicles entered into production around March of 1942 and ended September of the same year. In total, about 366 units were produced. The reason why only 300 some odd vehicles were produced was because although this vehicle had a lot of improvements over the previous generations, it was still thought to have some shortcomings that were basically carryover from the previous Sturmgeschütz design. It wasn't until the next iteration of this vehicle, known as the ausf, where the Sturmgeschütz would get a complete and utter overhaul, and that vehicle addressed a lot of the shortcomings that were found on this interim pattern that we have here. But rather than going into more information about that, that's best left for another video for another day. Let's go ahead and take this opportunity to take a step back to when the model was first started in order to get a good idea on what the base starter kit supplies you with. And here's the model at the start of the build. For the base starter kit, I'll be utilizing this vintage 1990s Dragon German Stug 3 ausf plastic model kit. This here is another one of those kits that I remember seeing a lot in my youth, and it was one of those kits that I really liked the box art on, but for one reason or another, I tend to avoid purchasing this kit up until very recently. This model here I procured off of eBay about a year ago, so it really hasn't been sitting in the stash for very long, just long enough to collect a slight layer of dust on it, but from here I could actually crack it open and dig into it because I'm ready now to tackle this kit. For the actual kit itself, like I stated before, this is a vintage kit from the 1990s time frame. This model here dates back to 1994, and at this time, like I've stated in several other Dragon build videos from kits on the same era, Dragon was really kind of an upstart model company at this time, and generally their tooling consisted of parts that were rehashed from other kits, namely from Italeri, where they would take the Italeri kit, throw some extra parts onto it, and sell it off as one of theirs. Well, they did this quite a lot during this time frame. However, there were limits to what they could do this to because obviously some kits Italeri never made any models of. And it just so happens that the Panzer III family was one of them. So unlike many of the other builds of that era, this one here is actually 100% Dragon tooling. And this kit here is another one of those kits that came out at a really interesting time because, like I've also stated before, the 1990s was really a desolate wasteland when it came for plastic tank kit builders. To illustrate just how anemic the armor hobby field was back during this era, at this point, if you were looking for a Panzer III pattern vehicle or a Stug 3 pattern vehicle, your only options that were on the table were the old kits from Tamiya. These kits were tooled up in the mid-1970s time frame, and even at this point here, were already out of production and have been for a number of years. Plus, if you were able to score one or both of these kits, you were going to be greeted with tooling that dates back to that era, which by the 1990s time frame were beginning to start showing its age. On top of the actual quality of the kits, you also were kneecapped with the variation. The Tamiya kit was only released as a ausf variant, so if you're looking for this pattern of vehicle or the earlier renditions of the Stug 3, you were basically SOL. And this was the environment where Dragon went ahead and dropped these kits that we have here. Not only was this particular kit released, but other variants of the Panzer III and Stug 3 family were tooled up as well. These kits were a humongous success, and not only because there was just nothing in the market like it, but to Dragon's credit, they did a phenomenal job with the design and tooling of these particular kits, which you'll see once I crack the box open. Now, although these models here haven't been in production for a good many years, they are still relatively easy to come by. This model here I purchased off of eBay, and I picked it up for anywhere between the upper teens to low 30s price range. So basically right there in the sweet spot on where you typically find model kits from the same era. Just like with many other older kits though, this is the type of thing you're not necessarily going to find in your hobby shop unless it's something that's like new old stock or one of those hobby shops that have stuff stuffed into a corner and you might find some treasures in there. This is the type of kit, as what's usually mentioned in these videos, are the type of thing that you'll find at a model show, swap meet, or possibly even a flea market. One other thing to point out, and you'll definitely see this once I open the box, is that the kit is made from 100% injection molded plastic. There are no other little add-ons that are found on this kit here, things like photo etch or any other type of detail accessory. Dragon were adding photo etch frets to their kits at around this time, but this kit here in particular, I don't believe received any of the upgrade photo etch sets that were being offered on the other kits that came right after the release of this one right here. Starting with the model's graphic design, just like it is today, Dragon always understood the concept of a good box art. Box arts sell kits, and with this kit here, it's no exception. This goes back, by the way, to Dragon's founding all the way in the late 80s and early 90s. Every one of their kits from day one always had killer box arts. And remember, at the same time, Tamiya's box arts were just that plain old white background with, the tank is nicely illustrated, but, the background is just that simplistic white coloring, and Italeri was really not that much different. Dragon, on the other hand, nah. So imagine yourself being in a hobby shop back in that era, and you're looking for a kit. It's, white background, like white background, white background. Ooh, what is this here? That looks cool. Hey, let me go and check this one out. And that's exactly what this brings to the table. Starting with the vehicle in the foreground, here we have the star of the show, which is the Stug 3 ausf, and it's driving past a burning M3 Stuart. The vehicle does have Cyrillic letters written on it. Clearly, this is a Lend-Lease vehicle. In the background here, we have a squad of soldiers, and just the rest of the background's just completely blacked out with the smoke from the burning tank. The quality illustration is really nicely done. In fact, this is actually one of my favorite Dragon box art, specifically of this era. This one here was quite prominently showed off in their old catalog that I remember thumbing through as a kid, and this one was one of those kits that stuck out at me. The quality of the illustration is very nicely done. You can see all the details are rendered in place, even some weld beads, which is nice. The suspension is illustrated to be going over some rough terrain. Nice little touch over there. And the M3 that's in the background is also rendered really nice, even in its completely trash state. Normally, box arts from this era were either drawn by Ron Volstead or Vince. Unfortunately, I'm not really sure on which illustrator this is. However, I have seen this illustrator's signature on a few other box arts from kits of the same period. From there, it takes us to the remainder of the typography. It's your typical typeface, which is used by Dragon, again, from vehicles of this era. Note that this here has the DML logo, which stands for Dragon Models Limited. Eventually, this would be switched out for just Dragon in the same type of red box that we have here. But DML was how these kits were generally seen during this time frame. Moving towards the side panel here, we have some brief information about the vehicle in question, as well as some importer info. This kit here was originally imported by Marco Polo Imports, and they imported all the Dragon kits in the US around this time period. Eventually, Marco Polo would no longer be doing the Dragon importation because Dragon USA popped up in California, and since that happened, they have been exclusively distributing the Dragon kits in this country. On the side here, we have the side panel, again, just the same thumbnail version of the main box art with the green tile here, which is typical for vehicles from the 39 to 45 series. Again, this is probably Dragon's biggest catalog line. This is kit number 6033, in case anyone was wondering. And on this panel here, we have some sample pictures of a completed model, which I'm not going to lie, do look pretty nice. Cracking open the box, we'll reveal the kit contents. And like I stated before, this kit here is all injection molded plastic. And the plastic used is this light gray coloring material, which is typical for Dragon kits of this era. Like I stated in another video, Dragon would eventually change the type of plastic that they use for their kits. And the newer kits they really do have a different feel to them. Starting with the first runner, luckily this bag is already open, so we get to see what the parts look like uninhibited by the plastic bag. Note that the parts are cleanly molded. There isn't any puddles or flashing to worry about. I'm also not seeing any sinkholes on these parts. Again, these parts were nicely molded by Dragon of this era. We have here some details found on the shocks to give you an idea of the detail fidelity that we're looking at. And here you can see the row wheels. The row wheels themselves, I could see people saying that the details on them are simplistic compared to what we typically see on more modern kits. Note that the row wheels do not have their little tubes that would be emerging from those smaller little holes. The well beads are there that are around the rim, but are a little bit on the softer side. Again, this is the type of detail fidelity that you would expect from the or I should say the early 1990s. And by the way, from that era, this here would have been like space age compared to, you know, the type of kits that we were used to of the period. So again, for this build here, these parts here should be more than suffice for the job at hand. But just to give you an idea on what they look like. There go the swing arms. All in all, some pretty decent pieces. Digging deeper takes us to the next runner. Here we have some of the tin work. Note you could see, hopefully, through the bag here, the German diamond plate. The diamond plate is nicely molded, and again, this is some good quality of kits from this era. And I would even say that this is pretty good even with today's standards. Note the front plate detailing here. Here we can see the main gun. It's a 2 half assembly, which is, you know, typical for kits even to today. And here we have the quarter slide decals. One thing I gotta point out, and this is a common trait I've seen on these older Dragon kits, is that the decal quality from the kits on this era were phenomenal. They go on without any problems, they don't break, they don't brittle, they lacquer on. They're just fantastic decals. So I never had decal problems in the past from Dragon kits from this period, and I'm not expecting any problems with this one here, but you know, who knows? Stuff can change. On the back here, it looks like I was mistaken when I said earlier that this kit does not have photo etch, because it most certainly does. Here we have, which by the way is a nice happy surprise on my behalf, here goes the photo etch for the grill covers. Note that these are very nicely done. And what's interesting to point out is that Dragon themselves give you grill covers here molded in plastic, but they're just your standard opaque or blocked off material type layout. Even Dragon themselves realized that maybe that wasn't a good idea, because they themselves supply with this nice set of PE. This PE here looks like it aged very well and could be stacked up with its modern contemporaries. Along here gives us some more PE. This, I believe, is a heat shield for the rear exhaust manifold, if I'm not mistaken, but we'll see more about that as the build progresses. All in all, looks like this thing is holding up pretty well. Moving further takes us to the fighting compartment runner. Here you can see the details that are molded in. Note it has all the proper detailing for the fasteners found on the top deck. As well as a replacement front plate. Just like today, Dragon kits of the era gave you a lot of spare parts, and this kit here will be no exception. Here goes the mantlet detailing. And this brings us now to the upper hull. Here we have the engine deck. Hopefully you can see the details of all the hinge work popping through the plastic bag. Some more detailing here on the front. We have those German sunken fasteners found on this little strip here. Some more tin work. And yes, the German diamond plate is present. And you can even see the fasteners here on that mounting plate for that light mount. And the hinge is also fully detailed with all of its little hinge sections and fastener details integrally molded in too. Note that in the back here, these two portions are molded with the cutouts present, which again, nice bit of detailing. Nice little touch. And even the deflector grill looks very nicely molded too. Towards the bottom, this brings us to the lower hull. It's your standard Dragon Panzer III of hull, and this piece here was recycled and reused on a number of different kit releases from Dragon. Now, of course, this kit being a Dragon kit from this era gives you these cancerous, horrible things, and as we know, I'm not even going to dignify this with a response because these tracks are trash and they are not going to be used on this model. In place, I'm going to be utilizing a set of workable track links from Rye-Field models. I'm going to open up this sealed bubble wrap bag here. By the way, this literally just came in today, so I haven't had a chance to even take a look on how these things assemble, but let me go ahead, take the bubble wrap off, and get back to you guys. And here's the box here with the bubble wrap removed. The set is from Rye-Field models. Rye-Field is a relatively new addition to the plastic model scene. However, they are one that have definitely made some waves. Their kit quality is through the roof on just about all the kits that I've seen, and they are really very impressive kits. The tooling on them is, it's hard to imagine quality this good on plastic model kits, specifically when you're used to building these old school ones. These tracks here I picked up off of Amazon. They are relatively easy to find on eBay as well. However, I just went with the Amazon route because it was just cheaper than some of the other vendors I found on eBay. But, you know, this does fluctuate. Do your homework when you're purchasing these pieces. The tracks did come in some really good timing. So, you know, you have that going for you, specifically if you have Amazon Prime. And they do have several other different variants of workable tracks for other kits on the market. And one thing I do like about these tracks, now normally I would go with tracks from Master Club or Fruli, or I try to find a set of rubber tracks from Dragon. The rubber tracks I wasn't able to track down, and the other tracks I was able to track down, those are really easy to come by, but the cost on them is pretty expensive. So I wanted to see if I could find a lower cost alternative, and I encountered these ones here, which retail anywhere from like 15 to 18 bucks, and you really can't, you know, really beat that. The metal tracks, albeit are, you know, really good quality, and I, you know, definitely recommend them. I recommend anything compared to those junk tracks that the kit gives you, but they do, you know, end up costing sometimes in excess of more than the kit itself. So for this one here, I want to see how well these tracks work out. I do want the caveat to say that these are the late pattern tracks as opposed to the kit ones, which are the early pattern units, which have those hollowed out guide horns on them. This one, the guide horns are solid, and I'm pretty sure some Panzer IV fanboy is going to be ragging at me for that, but I honestly don't care. For this build here, these tracks are going to be more than suffice for the build at hand. So let me open these tracks out. By the way, I've never seen these tracks in person before, so this is going to be interesting. Okay, so first here we have a little Ziploc bag, and this appears to be a assembly jig. I have seen this on a few other kits before. I believe Amusing Hobby did something similar to this with their low kit. And here go the tracks. These are injection molded plastic, but they are very nicely detailed and nicely molded. Again, like I said before, Rye-Field's details and quality are just, you know, through the roof. You can see the little ice cleats on them. Again, some really good quality to be found here. Now, to assemble them, they're the type where you actually have to glue the little pins in place in order to achieve the hinge mechanism, which should be interesting because I haven't really done a workable track set with this type of layout before, but, you know, this is all going to be an experiment here, and hopefully it should pan out pretty well. And in case anyone is wondering, here I have the original kit supply tracks, and here go the Rye-Field ones, and we can compare them side by side. Now, granted, these are the late pattern ones, and these are the early pattern ones, but you can see that the quality of the molding, even on the old Dragon kits, I will say, the quality of the tracks were very nice. They were nicely molded, and they did have some nice details on them. The only problem was they were almost impossible to put together. So, you know, but detail-wise, the Rye-Field ones are basically on par with the old Dragon ones from the 1990s. So, you know, take that for what you will. These tracks, for the record, sold crap though. Back to the original kit. On the bottom of the box brings us to the instruction manual. Typical for Dragon kits of the era. Let's see. And we have here some blue parts that are highlighted. Obviously, these are going to be relegated to the spare parts bin, but actually not too many spare parts on this one. This would change as Dragon kits would progress over the years, as they just went way more insane with the number of runners that just don't get used. But this will be interesting to see how this pans out. Bottom of the box, nice little color palette here with the different markings that are supplied with the kit, so you could render it in one of two different ways. Starting with the model's running gear, all of the kit supply components sans the tracks were utilized. This includes the swing arms, the road wheels, as well as the return rollers. All of the components I just mentioned were assembled out of the box without any problems. However, some of the changes that were made involved the sprocket as well as the idler wheel. These are the kit supply components, but in order to fit them to the tank with the workable track links, a few small tweaks were made along the way. Starting with the sprocket, the stock sprocket of course is made for use on the individual link and lane tracks, and because of that design, you have a small little peg that emerges from the final drive and the sprocket just plugs onto it. With the workable track links, however, that little design is not going to be suffice with keeping everything where it needs to be. The reason why the stock sprockets need to be modified is with the way I mount my tracks onto the vehicle. If the sprockets are glued to the vehicle permanently and are static and can't move, mounting on the tracks can be a bit tricky. You have to try to guide them through this little recess over here between the fender and the sprocket teeth, and in some cases you can get them through. It's a little bit tricky, but you can snag them. It can lead to issues like the track snapping or something stupid along those lines. The way I like to mount my sprockets on is where I take the sprocket, I wrap the track around it, and I basically slip it on to the vehicle as one piece. With the way the kit sprockets are designed, this is obviously not going to be the case because of those two small anemic little nubs that are found molded into the final drives. To alleviate this, what I do is I make the same modification that I've made on several other builds that are found on this channel, as well as I'm going to be mentioning it on a few other builds that are going to be posted on this channel in the near future. But basically, the little nubs that are found on the final drives are cut away with an X-Acto knife. With a 16 of an inch drill bit, I go ahead and drill out the two portions where the nubs originally were, and I also drill out the corresponding sections found on the sprockets themselves. The sprockets are fairly thick, however you want to be careful when drilling them out. You don't want to go all the way through, or else they'll protrude from this little belly button that we have here on the Panzer III hubcap. By going about 3/4 of the way, you have sufficient material in there to hold the sprocket up, and it is more than enough to secure it to an axle that I fabricate. The axle itself is nothing more than a 1/16 of an inch steel rod that gets connected to the two sprockets, and once everything is plugged in place, the sprockets are held onto the tank in a nice secure manner, and they actually do have some kind of roll to them like you see. This is really beneficial, specifically when you're mounting on the workable tracks like that are found on this vehicle here. On the rear idlers, these are of course the kit supply parts as well as the idler mounts themselves. However, one thing about the stock Dragon kit is that the idler does have some slight adjustability to it. When you're going with a workable track option like this, you don't want to glue on the idler mounts in a static manner at first. The reason why you don't want to do that is because of the track tension found on these tracks here. If you go ahead and just eyeball it and mount on the idlers permanently prior to the addition of the track, what happens is you run the risk of having the track either be too tight or possibly be too loose. By installing the idlers at the very end, once the track is literally fitted to the tank, you get to adjust the track tension accordingly so that your track tension is perfectly set and you don't have any of the problems that I just mentioned. While on that topic, this leads us to the tracks. Obviously, there was no way in hell I was going to utilize those Lincoln Lane tracks, so I used the Ryefield model ones instead. And this is a decision that I certainly do not regret. The Ryefield model tracks are absolutely awesome. They're just great. They give you fantastic detailing, the hinge work goes together very well, and they go together fairly quickly. Like I mentioned before, they're also much more affordable compared to some of the other aftermarket tracks that are on the scene. There are some better ones out there, namely from Fruley or Master Club, which they are made out of metal. However, if you're working on a 1/35 scale tank, you're on a slight budget, or you just don't think the metal tracks are really, for your needs, then the Ryefield model tracks are a perfect solution for that. The tracks go together with a small little template like I may have mentioned before. It's an alignment jig. You You line it up, you line 5 links on it, and then you go ahead and insert the pins. The pins are included with the set, and they are a bit on the fragile side, admittedly. However, with the way they are molded, it is very easily mounted to the model. The only caveat is that you as a builder have to use a very small amount of glue during the fabrication. If you use too much glue, the track links will be glued solid, and you no longer have a workable track link, and negates the whole purpose of it. And if you don't use enough, obviously the pins will just fall out on you and your suspension will just crumble, neither of which is ideal. For this tank here, I use just a small drop of super glue on each of the little pins. I put them on the very end, or I should say the head of the pin. Once everything is lined up in place, I let the glues fully set. Since I am using super glue, about 5-10 minutes later, I go in with a clean cut snip and I remove the section of sprue that contains the pins. Once removed, I could go ahead and line up 5 more links and repeat the process until I have the completed track bands that you see here. For painting, I did use just standard rattle can flat black spray paint for these, unlike the vinyl tracks, which you don't want to use rattle can spray paints on because they may have a chemical reaction with the rubber and possibly can melt them. For workable track links, it's a slightly different ballgame. The track links can hold up much better to standard spray paints, but you want to be careful with some of the brands you use. Some of the more expensive brands, oddly enough, like Rust-Oleum or Krylon, can possibly harm the plastic finish and can lead to issues. On this one here, the Rattle Can El Cheapo spray paint that I used from the Home Depot worked absolutely fine and then allowed me the perfect platform to dry brush the weathering that you see here. If you are unsure if the paints you're using are going to be safe with this material, one way you can test it is by taking the empty runners that are remaining from the track sets. By taking the empty runners, you can paint them with the paint of your choice, and by the time the paint dries, you will know if the plastic suffered any chemical reactions with the paint. Basically, pay attention to some of the way the pieces are molded, or more importantly, look at some of the numbers that are integrally molded into the runners. If the numbers are clear and crisp, your track should be good to go. If they are melted or appear to be soft, perhaps you might want to reevaluate the paints that you're using. From the track, this takes us to the exhaust manifold. All the kit components that you see here were utilized out of the box, and this is basically going to be the routine for the remainder of this video. The kit parts are very nicely detailed, and on the ones back here, we have the exhaust manifolds themselves, which are your standard Dragon plastic, but the little shield that you see here is made from photo etch. The photo etch was a very nice touch. It gets bent slightly in order to form the curvature that's found on this deflector plate, and then it was just mounted directly into appropriate location. The photo etch fits absolutely perfectly on the plastic parts without any hand fitting being required. Moving our way to the front takes us to the front toe points as well as the bow headlight clusters. The Stug 3 ausf.F is interesting in that you don't have your standard Bosch light as you find on the remainder of the German tanks that really came after this point here. The lights are housed in this interesting little tombstone type casing, and it's actually hinged. If you want to remove the blackout section, this front portion just hinges down and you have the unencumbered bulb exposed. The details found on the model are very nicely detailed. However, they need to be assembled in a sub-assembly type format. Because of this, you want to take your time and you don't want to lose the components during assembly. With the way they are molded, they do free pretty well, and this is going to be a common recurring theme on this video, the pieces are finely molded, but you have to have a lot of care in deburring them because you could easily either damage the part by cutting too close, or you run the risk of over sanding or over polishing the little burr off, which again can harm the look of the piece. So you want to go very slow and take your time with the assembly of these components. And needless to say, you definitely don't want to lose them. The components that you see on this model, they don't exactly give you duplicates of, so you want to take your time and you don't want to lose them. If a part goes off the lost part of you, you're going to be stuck trying to find aftermarket parts to fix it. Carrying on takes to the front visor block, and this is something that I've seen missed on a few other builds out there, and it's one that honestly perplexes me. This is because all of these detailing, namely of all the prisms that are on these vehicles, are integrally molded in, and there's no further scratch building required by you, the builder, in order to enhance them. Just with a swipe of paint, and you're basically good to go. On some builds out there, for people who do paint the periscopes, they seem to paint them in a few different colors. I've seen silver, and I've also seen blue. The silver is completely out of the question. Don't do that. It just doesn't really look good. And the blue, some people swear by. Me personally, on many of the real, basically all of the real military vehicles I've seen in person over the years, when you see the periscopes and the prisms, they tend to be black in coloring. The only time this is not the case is on more contemporary vehicles like M1s or Bradleys. Those vehicles have a red film on all of the prisms to prevent blinding by someone shining a laser light into the periscope. So on those builds, you want to go with a reddish tint coloring, but on the World War II and post-World War II vehicles, gloss black is my go-to, and it's the one that I personally recommend. On a similar standpoint, this takes to the two Fender lights that we have on either side. On my builds, I like to paint them in silver, and these two lights, by the way, were not colored in any way. They were just basic white lights. Some builds out there, I've seen people like to paint their headlights with a white coloring. Honestly, I'm not sure why people do that. If you look at no further than a flashlight or even your car headlights, regardless if they're LED or not, they're going to be silver in coloring. So bear that in mind when you're working on your models. From the headlight coloring takes us to the tin work themselves. The tin work on this model actually needs to be modified by you, the builder, in order to build it up to the configuration that you see it here. This is done because Dragon have lots of variants of their Panzer III kits, and they use as many of the same parts as possible to cut down on some of the costs of the molds, of course. Well, for this build here, you actually have to do twofold. First, you have to drill out several locations with a pin visor to secure on all of the tools and equipment that you see here. But you also, on this particular kit, need to cut off the front third section of the tin work. This is, again, due to the shape, I believe, of the ausf.F model, but Dragon does supply you with all the components, but it's kind of funny how you have to kind of modify the kit in order to bring it up to the condition that you see it here. For drilling out the holes, I recommend a pin vise with a really small micro bit. The bits I use are purchased from the vendor listed in the video description. I've used his bits on many other of my builds, and they're highly recommended. The pin vise is a fantastic way to drill it. You can also use a Dremel. However, personally, I believe the Dremel might be overkill for this and might actually cause some problems. You see, with the Dremel, even on its slowest speed, it's going to possibly remove more material than is required, and the hole is going to be larger than it needs to be. It's not going to be too much of an issue unless you go buck wild on it and you gore out way too much material. But personally, I found the pin vise to be a better choice for adding the holes that are found on the underside here of Tinworks on not just this model, but several other kits on the market as well. For cutting the fenders, this is best done with an X-Acto type saw, but if you use a sharp box cutter type blade, you can just score it a few times on the under sections, and then after a while the fender will just crack right in the appropriate location, and then you could assemble everything together. With the way the tin work is designed, there is this small little tongue and groove type system that's integrally molded in, so it does make connecting of the two halves much easier and less problematic. Also, where it wants you to cut the section in half, I believe there is a score line that is present on the piece, so after a few passes with a box cutter or two, the piece will really be able to snap off in a nice, clean manner. And that is a good design that the kit does have in that regard. The remainder of the tin work details, once the holes are drilled, drop onto their appropriate locations with no problems at all to be mentioned. And this leads us to the taillights that are found on the rear portion. On the blackout light, it has the little hinge plate in the downward position, which means the little squares are exposed above. These squares on these German tanks with this pattern of light are painted in a gloss green type coloring, as they would be on the real vehicle. This is just Tesser's enamel green, and it just does a really good job with giving you that look. On the opposite side, we have the round pattern of light, and note the way it's painted. We have a 2 half-moon system. The top portion is painted in orange, and the one on the bottom is painted in gloss red. This is one thing that's pretty tricky to actually find real resources on, but from the real examples I was able to study, they are in this type of configuration, and this is the type of thing you can easily make a mistake with on your build, so bear that in mind. Moving upward takes us to the rear engine deck, and just like with the tin work, you do have to drill some holes into the engine hatches here in order to secure these air vents. Again, really simply done, specifically if you have a pin vise on hand. From the engine hatches takes us to the side air intake grills. These again are kit supplied, and what's really cool about this kit is that it gives you photo etch covers for these components. The photo etch is very nicely done, and it's a really nice feature that are found on these kits, and specifically since it is stock with them. Along with the PE grills, you have the little antenna mounts that are located in these two sections, and the mounts are also made out of photo etch. This can be a bit tricky because you have to have a compound bend to these sections here in order to get them bent to the appropriate shape and to fit onto the model. This can lead to some problems, specifically if you don't have any experience with photo etch, but it's one of those things you really have to take your time with because each bend affects the other one, and if you have a mistake here, it's going to throw off the alignment of the antenna channel. Another thing I want to point out is with painting of them. With the way the units are designed, getting paint into these small little recesses on the inside of the boxes here is pretty tricky. So on this build, I actually built and painted, or I should say built and primed the model all in one piece, but without the photo etch added at that point. After the tank was primed, I went ahead and airbrushed the base coat on the inside portions of the grill work, or I should say of the intake work, and then once this was dry, the photo etch mesh sections were dropped directly into place, and then I was able to proceed with the remainder of the model's painting. This was just some of the weird little quirks that I had to do in order to get the model up to the condition you see it here. If not, if you try to just build everything and then paint it in one shot, you run the risk of potentially clogging up some of the holes found on the grill work. And if you do this, it really can hurt the look of the build. By doing it in the format that I mentioned before, it's a great way to mitigate that from happening. While on the antenna channels themselves, you'll notice that they are weathered in a brownish coloring. Keep in mind, on the real vehicle, the antenna channels are not metal but are actually made from wood. So they would weather in a slightly different manner compared to the remainder of the vehicle. This is one of those little details that miss several modelers out there, and it's a very easy mistake that you can avoid. Bringing us to the antenna base themselves, this kit's unique in that it features two antenna bases, and keep in mind on the real vehicle they would have the ability to retract into the antenna channels that I just mentioned. On this kit here I have them rendered in the deployed state, and the pieces are very nicely detailed and comprised of 2 or 3 parts in order to get your little cluster that you see here. On the wires themselves, these are made from fluoro wire. The kit does have 2 little nubs that emerge from the antenna base, which is typical on these kits, but you can't really model the antenna wire in place in that configuration. So the little nub was snipped away, or I should say on the kit original one was snipped away, and the antenna base was drilled out with a pin vise. Once the pin vise was done, I was able to slip on the little piece of fluoro wire, and then I painted in my usual format. The antenna base, of course, is rubber, so it's painted black. The middle section here is a tube on the real unit and would be brass, and then the remainder of the wire is just painted in black. This is the same configuration that I've mentioned on many of my German model tank videos, in fact, all of them for that matter, and for the same reasons that I typically mention. And on that subject, this takes to the cleaning staves. Like I've frequently mentioned, a common mistake I see on builds out there is that people mis-ID what these components are made from. They either render them as just solid wooden rods, or they think they were made out of metal tubes and render them in that format. In real life, the staves themselves would be made from wood rod sections, but the ends would be made from brass. They would be threaded on the real vehicle, and you can just thread everything together to form the lengths in order to swap the barrel. On the model here, I painted in my usual format. The middle sections are painted out of dark brown to replicate wood, and in order to facilitate the end connectors, just a simple swipe of gold paint is all you need just on the bare ends. By doing this, it greatly helps the look of the build, and it really spices it up compared to just having everything painted one color or possibly the wrong color. On this build here, it has the swab section pre-installed, but the swab is actually covered, or modeled I should say, with its canvas protective bag over it. So the bag on these vehicles would be a green coloring. It's basically the same type of coloring found on the German uniforms, and this is the color that I went for this build. By, again, just painting just some of the little details here, it's a great way to help the look of the build overall. Moving our way up takes us to the hatches. These all went on without any problems, and of course this vehicle gives you the option to have the hatches modeled in the open state or the closed state for one reason or another. The vehicle does not have any interior detailing on them, so for me I just modeled them in the closed state that you see here. Moving forward takes us to the gunner's periscope, which is a very interesting bit of detailing, and it's a unique one found on these Stug 3s. The gun would actually, or I should say the scope would be connected to the gun, and no matter which way the barrel would pivot, either left or right, this optic here would transverse with it, which is why it has this interesting channel here. This also has the ability to hinge open on the real vehicle, but on this one here, obviously I modeled it in the closed position. For painting the component, it's pretty easily done. These units are just painted in black. The front section was drilled out with a pin vise, much along the lines I mentioned before with the exhaust, in order to paint the little lens section, which again helps the accuracy of the build. From there, I guess, takes us to the main gun. The gun system on this model is nicely detailed. You do have the option to have it elevate and transverse. However, I went ahead and used some white glue on the inside just to keep it in the propped up state you see it here. Otherwise, you run the risk of having the barrel droop on you, which can possibly hurt the look of the build, or unless you're trying to model it in a diorama in that type of a format. The barrel itself is a two-part assembly, again, quite customary on these builds, so there is a small little seam to contend with running along the top and the bottom. Of course, this was easily polished away with some sandpaper and some thick super glue. After a few swipes, the super glue is thoroughly blended in, and the seam work is completely removed. Moving to the paint and the markings, this model here gives you the option to build this vehicle in one of two configurations. With the way the markings are present on this build, this was opting for the second option, which differs from the one on the box art. This model here has a two-tone camouflage pattern where we have the base coat being dunkelgelb, and then the dunkelgrün is then just airbrushed in this squiggly type format that you see here. The camouflage turned out pretty well with the paints that I used. I believe I used Tamiya olive green for this, and with the washes and everything that went on it, you see the look that is present on this build. From there, it takes us to the decals. The decals on these old school Dragon kits are just phenomenal. They really do hold up with age, and honestly are some of the best water slide decals I've ever come across, and they never disappointed me on some of the other builds I've built in the past. This one is no exception. After the decals were applied, the entire model, of course, was coated with VMS varnish. The varnish went on without any problems and paired absolutely perfectly with the stock Dragon markings. As you can see, there are absolutely no problems whatsoever with silvering or any other type of issues you would commonly run across with water slide decals. Again, it's a testament to show just how good these old school Dragon decals really were. At the end of the day, I'm really happy in how this build turned out. Like I stated earlier, this was one of those kits that was always floating around and I always wanted to get my hands on. And now that I finally have it added to my collection and built to the standards that we see it here, it feels really good to cross this one off of my to-do list. Which is a perfect way to segue us into skill level and recommendation. The vintage Dragon Stug 3 ausf.F kit, although it's as old as it is, the tooling in my opinion held up very well over the years. This model here can be built into a nice representation of the vehicle in question, with maybe just one or two extra aftermarket parts in order to spice it up really any further. And of course, for anyone who's a fan of this channel, you'll know exactly what I'm going to say next, and that is one bit of equipment that is not just an accessory that helps the look of the model, but in my opinion is absolutely mandatory, are the set of workable track links. The stock tracks that come with this kit here really should be left in the dustbin of history where all individual Lincoln Link tracks honestly belong. And not only will the addition of these components here help the look of the build, but it will greatly make the build go by in a smoother, more effortless manner. No matter which way you cut it, these tracks are absolutely mandatory for a kit like this. If you go ahead and incorporate them, your build will look 10 times better. However, even with the tracks not factored in, this kit here is most certainly not beginner friendly. This is in part due to the finely molded detail parts, as well as the components that are made in photo etch. An intermediate builder might also have a little bit of difficulty with this, depending on how much photo etch experience that individual has. If you're the type of individual whose idea of building a plastic model requires to crack open a box and to just grab the stock runners and just cut and glue things together without the need of drilling or possibly altering in any way, this kit here is going to be outside your comfort zone. And if you do have the equipment like the pin vise or the cutoff saws in order to do this type of procedure, at this point, you're probably going to be an intermediate builder, to which then one of these kits should be something that you could be able to tackle. Having said that, however, this kit is far from being one of the more complicated kits on the market in terms of photo etch parts. Some of the more recent releases out there give you vast quantities of that material, and in comparison to this one here, this one is by far very simplistic. This is the type of kit where you want to level up to if you're an intermediate builder. If you're the type of person that already built maybe one or two other builds in the past that got some small pieces of photo etch here or there, like grill covers or something along those lines, this kit here is a good way to level up from that point. If you take your time and you carefully bend the metal parts in the ways that are illustrated in the instructions and allow the glues to dry, you should be pretty good with the assembly of this kit. In addition to the photo etch and small plastic part aspect of this kit, another thing that really makes it not geared for beginners is the aspect that you do have to modify the kit in order to just build it out of the box to the configuration that we see it here. Like I mentioned before, several components on the kit need to be cut as well as drilled in order to just properly assemble it. If you're a beginner, you might not have the experience, the technique, or the tools required to do the steps that I just mentioned. Also, as a quick mini review, the Rye-Fueled model tracks that are found on this model here are 100% recommended for not just this kit, but basically any 1/35 scale Panzer III or Panzer IV kit that you might think of. They go together fantastic, they look great, and on top of that, they are much more affordable compared to some of the other options that are on the market. For recommendations, clearly, if you're a fan of World War II German armor, this kit here is basically a no-brainer. Chances are, if you are, you already have this kit either built and or in your stash. And if you don't, you might want to go ahead and dig one of these up on eBay because you're really missing out on a nice kit. On similar lines, if you're the type of person that really dig the assault guns or the Panzer III family, this kit again is an easy addition to add to your collection. The vehicle is a very interesting design in its own right and has an extensive amount of combat experience. With those two factored in, it would make a fantastic candidate for use on a diorama. Another individual who I'd recommend this kit to would be anyone who is a fan of building and collecting vintage plastic model kits. Well, namely like yours truly. Although, unlike some of the other kits on the market, where they are a bit tricky to track down and when found can go for some pretty expensive prices, these Dragon kits here from the 1990s time frame, by and large, are relatively easy to track down and when found can be had for some really affordable prices. Also, unlike some of the other kits that I just mentioned, where the tooling dates back to the 1970s or possibly older, those models, although they are cool in their own right, detail-wise really do show their age. This particular kit here, on the other hand, is one of the exceptions, and like a few of the other Dragon kits of this era, they really did age like a bottle of wine. So not only do you have a nice, cool vintage kit in your collection, but it's also one that builds and has some really nice detailing to it and can keep up, in my opinion, with many of the current kits that are out there on the market today. And with that, that wraps up this model showcase video for this 1/35 scale German Sturmgeschütz 3 ausf.F. If you like this video, be sure to subscribe to this channel, where it's a great way to keep up to date on new posted content, being 1/35 scale model showcase videos like, well, this one over here, or the other 1/6 scale project update videos that frequently get posted to this channel. Another way to keep in the loop of new posted content is by liking us on Facebook. There, I have more photographs of this particular build, as well as the other smaller and larger scale builds that have been posted on this channel in the past. Furthermore, don't forget to swing by eastcoastarmory.com for more 1/6 and 1/16 scale builds and detailed components. I'll see you on the next one. Take care.